Starting. And welcome to the next edition of SciFund Voices, a conversation about science outreach, science crowdfunding, all sorts of interesting topics about connecting to the outside world about your science. I'm Jai Ranganathan. I'm Executive Director for SciFund Challenge, a nonprofit focused on connecting science and society and empowering scientists to connect to the public. Okay, this month's panel is really exciting because we are going to be talking to, well, I'll tell you how this started. So 2 months ago, our first SciFund Voices panel, we had a whole bunch of people interested in science crowdfunding, and then a question was asked, so how do we get journalists to write about our stuff? And there were 7 distinguished scientists, dead silence. So like, maybe we need to bring some journalists on to understand how this whole world works. So with that in mind, I thought I would bring this distinguished panel on. And I think there's I'm going to just ramble slightly more, then we'll get going with the questions. I think there's a lot of I think that as far as scientists are concerned, there's sort of 2 big frustrations. Well, there's so many frustrations when dealing with science journalists, but I think there's 2 big ones. The first one is, well, how do you get scientists and journalists to write about your stuff? Mm-hmm. And secondly, if they write about it, how do they write about it correctly? What at least scientists perceive what's correctly. Those are the frustrations. Well, you know, I could say science journalists have their own frustrations, and maybe the best way to understand how best to work with their world is to understand the world a bit better. So that's why we have this very distinguished panel to actually talk about these issues. So let's start with Shraddha Chakradhar, who is an assistant editor at Nature Medicine, and she also has worked at Nova and a bunch of other places as well. A simple question for you: what does your day look like?
Well, right now I'm at a conference in Seattle, so this is the exception. But normally, my day, I go into the office at around 9 o'clock. I'm based out of Boston, by the way. The main Nature Medicine office is in New York, but we have an office in Boston, and I work out of that one. But I go in, I spend the first hour or so catching up on social media. Social media management is part of my responsibility as assistant news editor. And then I also look through my news feeds, catch up on press releases and news articles, see what happened, you know, in the 6 or 7 hours that I was sleeping or whatever. And then I normally have interviews lined up for stories. If there's writing to be done, I do it. Most of it at that point. Editing, if I get edits back from my editor for stories that I've been working on. And constant research, you know, just because I'm writing a story doesn't mean the research part is done. Check social media every so often around noon. Again. And that's kind of my day. Every so often, every month and a half, I'll pop out into the Boston area for like a day-long conference or something. And then every 2 or 3 months, I travel to larger conferences like the one I'm at right now. That's generally kind of my day, so 9 to 5. But it doesn't really stop. I go home, still continue to read constantly. It's a lot of reading, whether it's journal articles or other news articles, or to see what other people are saying on Twitter or Facebook. You never really know where the next story idea might come from, so I keep all my options open.
So let me bring John Rennie into the conversation. John Rennie is currently editorial director for McGraw-Hill's Access Science, but he's done a lot of things in the past. Maybe most prominently was being for many years editor-in-chief for Scientific American. John Rennie,
hi.
Here's a question for you. What makes for a great science story?
Well, it is a great question. It's the one that we're constantly asking ourselves, and I think one really important point to start with, in maybe a surprise to a lot of the scientists who will be listening, is that the answer to that question is going to vary a lot from one publication to the next. There are certain kinds of things that are commonalities that would go all the way across, but something that would be, say, a great story for Scientific American would not necessarily be a great story for Nature Medicine or for PNAS or for Newsweek or for lots of other places. It's because they all have different audiences to start with. So, you know, broadly speaking, what we're all looking for is a good story. And I would start it with that more than necessarily, well, what's the most important science? We'd like that to be the case, but all of us really wants a good story because story is what our audiences will engage with. But of course, our audience has to really, they have to know something about it. They have to be able to understand that. So, Shraddha's audience, the science professionals who would generally be reading Nature Medicine, they're a lot better able to engage with a certain level of scientific detail than, say, the largely lay audience of non-specialists that, like, a Scientific American would have. But if you want something that's going to be surprising, for news stories, you're certainly looking for something that's new, although there's some interesting room on that to sort of negotiate what that can be. It's great when there are characters. You want something that's going to be sort of surprising in a lot of ways, but you also want it to be something that means something. It has to be something that's the news in the story has to be meaningful, not just to the people who are doing it, but to the people who are hearing about it. It doesn't really matter if you've made an important discovery about a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, for example, if you can't translate that into something that the audience is going to understand what the implications of that are for disease or for future pharmacological research or so on.
So, let's talk about that a second. So let's draw this. It seems to me you're drawing a distinction here between, there is a distinction between great science and a great science story.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you can talk a bit more about what really is, what are some cases, you mentioned one where it's just too hard to explain. Is that the main one, where a great science wouldn't make a great science story, or the vice versa, where maybe it's not the most exciting science, but it makes for a great science story?
And this is definitely, I'm sure, Shraddha and David have definitely their own perspectives on this too, but I'll start off with saying that although we would love to think that all great important science has a great story that can be made out of it, and I think most of us do believe that with some level of work you can, when you're talking about a story that's suitable for the different audiences you're going to, sometimes it's a lot harder than others. So that's sometimes the things that when scientists look at what happens to the science that's being reported and they get frustrated or annoyed, they feel like, you're playing up a controversy that's really not the most important thing here, or you're playing up some kind of potential payoff, the standard of this someday may help us cure cancer line that shows up in virtually every molecular biology story that's ever been written. That's frustrating for the scientists, very understandably, but it's often because you've got journalists who may feel under the gun to come up with some way to make the story pay off, to make it seem like this is something, to make the importance jump out to that audience.
Well, it's great. And maybe you could talk about just a second. I'm going to go to our next guest. So at Scientific American, who was that audience? Who is that audience? And what kind of things seem to appeal? What sorts? What are the kinds of things you'd look for at that particular place?
So at a place like Scientific American, the average reader at Scientific American is somebody who is not actually a scientist. It would typically be someone who's an intelligent, educated reader, typically somebody who's got an undergraduate degree, and it may have typically been in one of the sciences or engineering, some sort of technical area, but mostly this is read by people who've gone on into other professions in life, and reading something like Scientific American is their way of staying in touch with what's happening in science, but of course they're non-specialists, so they're looking for the exciting, interesting things. So, at Scientific American, you've obviously got a lot of people who are interested in cosmology and neuroscience, human evolution. These are all big kinds of topics that almost always really touched a button. At one time, dinosaurs were something that people got really excited about. The funny thing is that during the 20 years I was at Scientific American, I saw dinosaurs sort of burn out as a hot subject area. And I think it's because we sort of ran out of the most interesting things to say about dinosaurs for a while.
Much like dinosaurs in real life, which burned out. So I'd like to bring David Harris into the conversation. David Harris is the former editor for the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences news section. Boy, that's a long mouthful right there. And he's also the former editor-in-chief of Symmetry magazine. So for the places that you've worked, what makes for a great science story, and how would that be different between the two places where you're most recently working?
Well, actually, they're very different for the two places. If I compare Symmetry Magazine with PNAS, because we had extremely different audiences. As John mentioned before, the different stories suit different publications, which suit different audiences. And it really depends on what you're trying to do. I'll speak primarily as an editor rather than as a journalist. Because that's what my role was at these publications. But as the editor, you are basically a reader's representative. So you are trying to get inside the heads of the readers of your publication, understand what they're interested in, what their lives are like, what sort of context they have in their lives, and how you can contribute meaningfully to their lives in some way. So for PNAS, our readers were primarily working scientists, the sort of people who could potentially contribute papers to PNAS or other leading journals, so working scientists typically, and most of them already stay well in touch with the science in their own fields. So we wanted to bring them science from other fields, and it's not necessarily the greatest science, because I think it's futile to try to judge what is the greatest science that's happening at any point. So instead, as John mentioned, I'd be looking for a good story that was solid, important science, but also delivered some, dare I say, entertainment value to the audience, something that they just enjoyed reading. And you know, entertaining might mean very intellectual for that audience, but it had to connect with them in some way that they actually wanted to stay through the piece. At Symmetry Magazine, we had a very different sort of case, because the main audience there were, in fact, policymakers and opinion leaders and the general public. So we felt we had a responsibility to inform people who made decisions about the future of particle physics. That's what Symmetry Magazine was about. Informed them about what was going on in the field in such a way that they could make decisions for the public about what was going on. And the public, of course, wanted to just know what tax dollars were being spent on, what were the exciting things that were happening in the field, and why they should bother being interested and bother supporting the whole field. So those sorts of stories were slightly different in tone, but the thing that they all have in common is a solid story element that really connected with our audience's lives in some meaningful way.
You know, one thing I'm getting from all of you is the idea of a story, and tell me if you agree, is that maybe this is a big difference between a scientific paper and a science story, is that you have to enjoy the story. You mentioned the word entertainment in there, and maybe that's sort of a bad word, but maybe it's not. And because when I think of most scientific papers, enjoyment and entertainment generally doesn't go high up on the list of what you expect in most of them. Is that a distinction you mostly would draw as well? Like this idea of like enjoyment and entertainment?
At some level, I know that I would. I mean, I had an old boss of mine who said basically there are only two reasons that people read anything. They read it for work, or they read it at some level for entertainment. And all the scientists that I've ever worked with on stories, I have always tried to impress on them that, you know, this may be an experience different from anything else that they've ever done in their professional communicating life, because when you're dealing with the public, nobody has to listen to your science. Nobody has to hear about this. Their jobs probably don't matter. They're not your students. They're not your colleagues. Their lives will probably go on quite happily, even if they never hear anything about the important discovery that you've just made. You have to give them a reason to pay attention to it.
Right, and even though our audience, you know, is largely scientists, we do have, you know, members of the lay public that read us as well. It's not, it spans the entire course of, you know, biomedicine and health. So it's not going to be just oncologists or just cardiologists. So even if it's a story that has to do with cancer drug development, you have to get, you know, the cardiologist to care. You have to get people outside of your immediate specialty to care about it. And the best way, one of the best ways, I think, to do that is to get a compelling story that will stick with people, because facts and figures are fine, but what they're going to take away really is something that perhaps has that human element, something with, to use David's phrasing, that entertainment value, because that's what sticks with you. If you're telling somebody else about another story, sure, you might call on facts and figures, but what you really, recall and remember are those other things that add color to the science.
All of my writers are used to hearing me use the line that scientists are people too. And by that, I mean that scientists will read all sorts of things for their professional work, but sometimes they don't want to read as professionals. They just want to read as human beings and read something that is edifying and interesting, but without necessarily wearing their professional hat at the time. And so that dictates a lot about how you might write a good story.
What do you think, and this is a question for any of you, what do you think are the main things that scientists don't get about being a science journalist?
So one of the frustrations you brought up initially, is that many times we are accused of not representing the science correctly. I just want to impress upon the scientists that are tuning in that it is very embarrassing for us if we don't get it correct. It's not that we're very callous about it. We have a rigorous fact-checking process at Nature Medicine, and far be it from printing something that might be erroneous, I get really embarrassed even if during the fact-checking process something that's like slightly different from what I remember having reported comes up. It's really, we are constantly striving for that perfect fact-checking process where zero errors come up, like when the fact-checker combs through it and they have no questions, no qualms. So we do try very, very hard to make sure that your science is represented correctly, because we also take a little bit of ownership when we're representing it, when we're writing a story about it. And so it's as much as it is a reflection of you, it also kind of is of our reporting and what we do.
At the same time, and I can absolutely, completely agree with everything that Shraddha is saying about that, but I mean, I think it is also important for the scientists to understand that when we are being judged for our work, it's not necessarily just on the metric of they never made any mistakes. I want to say this sort of very, very guardedly, because I really, really don't want to make it sound like we're just too happy to throw in the towel and not care about getting things exactly right. But particularly when you're dealing with communication to the broader public, which doesn't have a lot of specialized knowledge, a certain level of trading off precise accuracy is acceptable in the spirit of trying to make sure that people understand the larger truth correctly of what you're saying, which is why so many different sorts of metaphors and analogies get picked up and used a lot. And even though you as specialists may say, that's really not a very good analogy, it may work really well for the audience that's hearing it, for helping them get 95% of the way to understanding this correctly, because the remaining 5% doesn't actually matter to them. They're never going to need that precise accuracy in their own application of that knowledge.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that the most common misconception I hear or recognize among scientists about science journalism is that journalists are not the same as press officers. Journalists are not cheerleaders for the science that they're reporting on. Obviously, scientists, that doesn't necessarily mean we want to be combative in how we approach stories, and we do want to work with the scientists as well as possible to make sure that everything is accurate and a good representation of the story, but it's also our job to put it in a larger context, to point out where there might be shortcomings with a particular study, where there might be conflicting opinions within a field, where there might be conflicting papers or evidence or data of some kind. And we have to try to untangle all of that and all in search of, as John put it, the bigger truth. That's what we're really after here. So we're not here to say, take your paper and just translate it for a lay audience. We do a lot of that in what we do, but it's not really our primary job. And if we were seen as purely cheerleaders for science, we'd be out of our jobs pretty quickly in most cases.
Right. It's also our job to contextualize that particular study, put it in a larger framework, and in that process, speaking to what John said, you know, we have to call on metaphors and analogies to help the lay audience understand why this is important in context of the larger field.
So I'm going to interrupt for 1 second just to say that we're also taking questions later on in the conversation from both Twitter and if you're going to Twitter and in the Google Q&A. So if you're in Google Plus, you can just put in a question in the Q&A and we'll see it. Additionally, you can type a question in Twitter, use the hashtag SciFund, that's SCIFUND. That way I'm going to see it, and I'll be sure to ask our panelists. You know, let me get back to this question here of sort of bring the larger picture and contextualizing. How do you do that? Because, you know, I think of my own field. I'm an ecologist. I'm a PhD in ecology, and I think of my own department. I got my doctorate in a biology department. I didn't even understand the titles of talks, of molecular cellular talks. I didn't even know, I know what the heck was going on, let alone chemistry or geology or anything else. In my own department, I had no idea. I couldn't give you a context of what's going on with cell membranes.
Yeah.
So how do you do that? And given that you every day you'll be working on 4 different things on completely different topics.
Talk to people, a bunch of people who work in a similar field. You would never talk to just the authors of that one study. You would talk to somebody else who works in the field and ask them for commentary on that. And you would just, I get most of, you know, my understanding from talking to multiple people to help me understand. And that's something else that I would ask on behalf of science journalists from scientists is patience when we're trying to understand and when we talk to you about a lot of the science because they, you know, you all scientists in the field, you're in it, you're working in it, you know where a new study might stand, you know, against the other new research that has come out, research that's been out for a while. And so you have thoughts on that, and so you help us learn about it as well.
I think it's very important to try to take advantage of your own naivete about these things. You know, it's good when you don't know anything about an area to go in to ask the stupid questions. And to ask the questions that you, as just a curious, science-interested person, want to know. And you know, that's a really important thing to try to impress on new science journalists, is not to be afraid to ask the questions that might make them look stupid. Because the answers to that are probably things that a lot of their readers would really need to know too. And we want to. A really good science story anticipates the kinds of questions that the readers are likely to have and finds a good way to present that information as a smooth part of the narrative without making it sound like you're talking down to them in any way. And so, you know, it's good to ask those kinds of questions.
Yeah, it's definitely the case that we talk to a lot of people, and I think that what we really do as science journalists is trade off depth for breadth. So whereas we might know the exact protocols that you use in some experiment, we know perhaps more than you do about what's going on in the field at the surface level, just because that's the way we need to operate. I mean, most of us have a good deal of science in our backgrounds and started to specialize in some area to some degree, but decided to take a different path where we learned more broadly than deeply, and it's just a different kind of learning, and it's a different approach to science. So we still try to pick up as much knowledge as we can about science. It's just not in the same way that you would if you're a researcher.
So for scientists, it's a very clear process of how they're hired and promoted, especially if you're looking at research universities, in which case it's really all about your papers and grants, probably primarily your papers and coming up as a close second is your grants, is really makes the decision of who gets hired at what universities, who gets promoted. But how does it work for science journalism? What's the process by which, what are the things that people are looking at you for, or your colleagues for hiring and promotion? Because obviously that's going to really dictate the kinds of stories you write, I would think.
A big part of it is how much you bribe your editors and how fast a typist you are. That's pretty much, those are the key things I see.
So no, bribery and speed of typing.
I mean, it's what you would expect. I mean, it's, you know, particularly these days where, you know, people, virtually every story is subject to different sorts of online metrics. Did you write a story that a lot of people click through to read? Did they finish reading it all the way through? Did it get a lot of comments? Did it get passed around through social media a lot? I mean, those are sort of obvious kinds of metrics that when editors are looking at people on their staff, they of course are saying, wow, that's, you know, that's why she's really doing well. And of course, I mean, the other kinds of things that you know, that Shraddha mentioned too. I mean, obviously, somebody who, if I'm looking at her work and I can tell, like, well, she's always really attentive to the facts, and she always, you know, she's always very careful. She always finds extra sources to talk to. She's a great journalist, and she's a great storyteller. You know, those are the things that jump out to me when I would be looking to promote somebody.
I always try to hire a mix of early, mid, and late career journalists on projects that I'm doing, because they all bring different valuable things to the process. So I guess I have slightly different criteria for these different categories of journalists. I mean, when I'm looking for younger journalists who are early career, not necessarily younger, but let's just say early career, what I'm really looking for is the hunger, I call it. They are in a desperate need to find good stories that are out there and tell the best of them to the best of their ability to an audience. And that goes an awfully long way. That sort of enthusiasm and drive goes a really long way toward being able to find and write good stories. When you get further on in your career, you want an established record of being able to write, hopefully, well, definitely accurately, hopefully quickly, and then you also start to look for things like, what is this person actually like to work with? Is it a good collaborative process? Do we click as an editor and writer? Are we able to work together to create a better piece? Because I'm a big believer in the best journalism coming out from a combination of a writer and editor working together. And so I think it's important that you are able to develop some sort of rapport between both parties, and realize that you have the same end goal, but that you're coming at it from different perspectives. One of you is representing the story, one of you is representing the reader. One of you might be representing the science, one of you, while they're doing that, is taking a more critical view. One is representing the details, the other is representing the context. And you take on these different roles at different times, but it's a balance between all of these different sorts of things. And so finding a person who can work with you and be a good foil for your ideas is important as well.
So a lot of factors have been mentioned here, but I'd like to focus on one, which is the one that John mentioned about essentially the popularity of the stories that are written. I mean, there's a lot of factors that are going about here, but how important is that one relative, like that? How many times is it clicked through and read? How much is that story actually read? How important is that in relation to everything else?
I mean, it's ultimately it's really kind of the most important thing. A story that doesn't get read at all, it doesn't matter how accurate it is, it doesn't matter how important the underlying facts are. If the treatment of the story is such that no one wants to pay attention to it, then it's at some level it's a failure. And whether it was a failure in the choice of subject or the execution of the story, that's not a good thing. You know, we need to reach our audiences, and we need to make them care about things.
I think it depends a little on the publication, though. From my experience at Symmetry, we certainly cared about what stories were interesting and popular to people, but we also felt that we had a responsibility as one of the few publications covering particle physics in depth to be almost a historical record as well, so that we would write stories that were important to the field, even if they weren't necessarily immediately popular, but with the knowledge that over time people would want this information. So one of the real challenges, I think, in this very fast-paced news world is that if you're always looking at the metrics for who's reading a story this day, this hour, this minute, you're missing out on almost the longer tail of stories and the stories that pick up readers over a much longer duration. And that's important as well. So I think that sometimes drives the decision. When, will this story last and be meaningful in the future? And it just depends on what kind of publication you are and what sort of stories you write.
I guess that makes sense. Go ahead, Shraddha.
Sorry, and many times it also helps to inform future areas of coverage. If you know that one particular story, picked up a lot of interest, maybe that might be an area that you could explore more in depth, see other avenues of that field that might perhaps, provide fodder for a future story. So it's good feedback for the future as well, not just for that particular story, but it also helps inform what is getting people interested that you might want to explore in the future.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Oh no, I would certainly echo both of those points. It is, there are a lot of different things beyond just popularity that go into stories, but I do think it's really in understanding the state of science journalism, science communication today and differentiating it from the past, there's more science communication going on now and more accessible to audiences than there ever was before. And although it is still true in a lot of ways that, especially for certain publications, that they do have a kind of responsibility that they need to mention certain discoveries because it falls so squarely inside their mandate, and they have to have a story of record on that. I think that in a lot of ways there's less and I think, let's put it this way, I think that news organizations that are just covering news because just to be on the record with it, I think that's less and less a compelling recipe for success. That these days more and more different publications need to be able to stand out in the originality of their treatment. Shraddha was talking about how, it's absolutely true. It's like the standard default thing for everybody in science journalism. It's kind of your day starts off by filtering through the latest round of press releases and journals that you're reading. In science journalism, unlike most other areas of journalism, so many story leads just come to you. And if you can fill whole science sections just by writing stories about, they're based on the embargoed press releases that are coming from a small number of top journals. And at that point, your stories will be, at some level, exactly like a lot of other stories that will be written. I think smart editors, smart journalists these days are looking for people who can get outside of that cycle and find ways of, in some cases, getting out, just going off and going into laboratories and talking to scientists to get ahead of the curve of the press releases and publication, or in some cases going back and finding evergreen topics that, maybe the paper of note came out 6 months ago, a year ago, 5 years ago, and maybe it's time to go back and see the underlying story that nobody else is paying attention to anymore.
So let's talk about that. I want to sort of talk a bit about on the changing face of journalism. There's been, obviously, most people now are aware of the fact that, more aware of, boy, journalism has changed a lot in all sorts of ways. And I'd like to quickly talk about the cash crunch in journalism. And obviously, has the cash crunch affected science journalism more than journalism generally? Less? How is that? And what does that mean for the number of people actually formally reporting?
I would say that actually science journalism is probably doing better than a lot of journalism in many ways, and that's primarily because specialty journalism is doing better than general journalism across the board. Just general newspaper reporters are being laid off at increasing rates, it seems, whereas niche publications, some of them are doing really quite well. And growing. So I think really science journalism in many cases falls into that latter category when it's done for niche publications. I think science journalism for typical metropolitan newspapers is in a very sorry state and facing a lot more challenges ahead. But it depends on which particular sector you're looking at.
So what you're saying is essentially there's a growing market for journalists in places like Symmetry Magazine, but maybe not for your local newspaper.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen a lot of new science publications start up in recent years. Many of them online only, some with print components to them, some very ambitious, some smaller scale. But there are a lot of startups in this area, so there are quite a few jobs going, but they might not be the traditional kinds of jobs that you saw 10 or 20 years ago.
Yeah, and outside of publications, I think the cash crunch, I'm sure, but it's also you know, allowed for other media for science. So before you said at the beginning I worked at Nova. When I started into this field, I didn't think I would be working in the broadcast journalism field. I was going to be a writer. I am a writer now, but I think it has afforded more opportunities for science journalism to be done in other sort of media. So I worked at Nova. I did museum videos. Science podcasts are taking off. So I think one of the sort of benefits of this is
Shraddha,
that
I'm going to cut you off.
you have more or niche publications, have all of these other.
I'm going to cut you off just because you're breaking up a little bit, but I think we
sorry.
get your. No worries at all. I do have a question from Twitter, which sort of connects to all of this. So we've talked a lot about the official journalists, but how does it all fit together? Because there's plenty of quote-unquote unofficial people. You think of people just blogging and putting up YouTube videos and I think A Minute Physics and all of the others. How does that all work together in terms of just scientists who are blogging or just quote-unquote civilians blogging or putting up videos, and you guys who are like the major leagues? How does it all fit together? And how does it affect science journalism? Is it sort of like made it a race to the bottom or a race to the top, or how has it changed it?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, go ahead, David.
I think everything really sits on a spectrum, and it's hard to draw any defining lines. And people have debated for a long time: is blogging journalism, all this sort of thing? Well, it can be, and it might not be. It all depends. I think that if you're going to try to draw a distinction, about the only place I can think of is: are you publishing this work for the benefit of the reader or the benefit of the people doing the work? And sometimes those coincide, and you can satisfy both at once, but in many cases you're not. And I think that if you are going to draw a distinction, then you put journalists on the side of you're there in service of the reader and their need for uncovering the larger truths in society. But there's a lot of really valuable science communication going on that doesn't have that perspective. That doesn't make it worse or lesser or anything like that. It just makes it different. These are different roles that we have in society, and I think we need all of them.
And I think just to tag on that, I think that maybe you draw the classic, maybe the best thing I've ever heard of the difference between a journalist and a press officer is the press officer is working for the scientist, and the journalist is working for the reader in the end.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would agree with what David said. I mean, that is certainly one. That's one of the big important distinctions out there. I mean, there's a different kind of access aside from your sort of whose interests you're serving. About also going just to the questions of sort of goes to the quality or credibility of the information, and this does go to how well or rigorously people tend to apply some of those traditional independent journalistic values of getting the right kind of context, writing about things independently and objectively, bringing a lot of quality to it. But the sad thing is that neither of these metrics necessarily always coincides exactly with people who are professional journalists and professional journalism organizations and people who are the very skilled amateurs. And I say amateur purely in that spirit of people who are doing it out of just the sheer love of the work. A lot of the best science communication going on these days is, quite frankly, being done by people who aren't really being paid for it. They do it on their own platforms, and there are a lot of people at legitimate publications who are phoning it in by pretty much rewriting press releases, or in some cases, serving the interests of sponsors more than they are those of the readers who are expecting an independent appraisal of the work.
So, if you're a scientist today, let's describe the situation I was in. This is a very self-interested question. So, I had a paper come out in December, and I was trying super duper hard to get the press to write about it, and I had a fat goose egg on it. And if you're trying to get people to, what is the strategy these days if you're trying to get journalists to pay attention? I mean, is the old press release method still useful? I mean, we didn't find it useful. Maybe our release could have been better. But how do you do it these days, and who do you talk to? I mean, is it better? Are you better off just trying to hit the chief science writer of the New York Times? Or are you better off writing to a blog like Deep Sea, like I think of a very popular marine science blog, Deep Sea News, just contacting them? I mean, how do you think about this if you're trying to get the word out?
So I'd start off.
Let's start with Shraddha.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say the old press release model is not useful, because a lot of us still get it that way. So I wouldn't say abandon it, but at the same time, continue to talk about your work to other people, because in a very, traditional, I guess, social networking way, the way we find out about a lot of scientists' work is when other scientists say, oh, this person is doing really interesting work in this arena. So to be out there to engage, either you can blog about it or talk to other scientists about it, but not talking about your work is definitely going to make it harder for us to find you as well. So the more you talk about your work, whether it is to journalists or to other scientists, you should be open about communicating it. I'm at this conference, and I have this badge that says media, and people are scared to talk to me, and it's disappointing. But at the same time, if you won't talk, even if you don't come to these conferences or anything, there's no way we're gonna know about it.
John and David, same question. What's a good strategy these days to get people to write about your stuff coming out?
I mean, I would start off by taking it back a point and saying, so what is it exactly that you expect them to write? I mean, they're not going to write about that. Hey, good news, Jay wrote a paper. What they want is I would take it back to you, and this is it's almost a cliche at this point to say this, but there's the idea of the elevator pitch, which is, so imagine that I'm the editor of Scientific American. You know what Scientific American's audience is like. I get into an elevator with you, and for 30 seconds, you have my complete attention. Tell me in 30 seconds what it is about what your paper establishes that makes it worth the while of the audience for Scientific American. I think a lot of the problem is that people don't have a very clear sense of what that message is, and if you can't boil it down to tell me what's the good story, then I have no reason to make that a good story.
I think it's gotten even more extreme in a lot of cases because so much information is coming across our desks in all sorts of media and all sorts of fashions. You almost need to be able to write the headline for a journalist to capture their attention. If you can do that effectively, then you've got a good chance of grabbing their attention. If you can, actually pitch to them what a good headline for this story would be. Don't expect them to actually use that headline, but if you can use that technique to get it across, that's extremely useful. If you can get past that hurdle, then you've usually got a bit more time to explain the story in a little more depth, and you can get into it. But you need some sort of hook to grab the journalist or the editor at the outset, and the briefer the better, while still representing the story accurately and fairly. Of course, this is near impossible to do, but there are very many talented people out there who are quite good at this. I'd say it takes practice, and it takes a lot of very careful reading of news and the sorts of publications where you want to be covered. You need to actually invest a bit of time in reading these publications and even asking yourself simple things like, well, how long are their headlines? How many words? How many sentences are there in a paragraph? How many words are there in a sentence? If you're in a publication that has average, 8-word sentences and 2-sentence paragraphs, and each story is 5 paragraphs long, that's very different to a long-form feature which might have very different characteristics, and it means that you will probably want to pitch a story in a different way.
Ideally, the public information officers that you work with would be in a good position to be able to help come up with exactly those kinds of answers, but in a lot of cases, I think these days I would suggest that scientists should sort of start to think a lot of that through for themselves even ahead of that, because the PIOs just may not have enough to go on in some cases.
So Shraddha, so is it useful just to hit you up by email or Twitter if I have something come out I want you to pay attention to, or is that going to hit your attention? What's going to get your attention?
Yeah, no, I will definitely read it because we don't do breaking news. We don't tend to cover, hey, this study just came out, I'm going to write up about it. But it'll definitely go in, like a folder that I always have where I collect story ideas. If a bunch of different studies come out that refer to larger trends, then yeah. Or if there's something in there that piques my interest, I will probably call you up and say, what about this particular thing is, particularly relevant to people who are not you, who are not in your field, so it'll definitely get my attention. I'm not, so far, my email inbox is not so overwhelming that I don't read emails, but, and same with Twitter, but, yeah, I think the bottom line is you need to be able to answer why someone that's not me or not on the author list will care about this study. Why should somebody who is not immediately involved be able to care about the study? And if you can answer that question, I think you'll start to be able to get to why other people might, and also you might be able to get it to our hands better. It's like the old thing where they say if you're having difficulty understanding a concept, try and teach it to somebody else. So I feel like talking to other people about your work, many times those questions that we might have will present themselves, and so you'll be able to get that clarity about your work as well as that little bit of distance and context about why other people will care about it as well. So yeah.
So is there if I've got a story I want to pitch, do I call you? Do I send you an email? Do I tweet at you? Do I send you something on Instagram? An actual letter? I mean, what's the most? How do I get? I mean, you mentioned the idea of information overload here. So, what's a good way to cut through the clutter? The most likely way to cut through the clutter?
Wow, that's a tough one. But I would say have something that's brief and incisive early on in your communication, in whatever form it comes in. I think most of us at least glance at everything that comes our way, but often we don't have the resources to give it much more than a glance. So you need to be able to capture our attention pretty quickly. So that's important. I'd also say that you have a better chance of reaching me if I've heard from you before, if I have some kind of relationship with you, or with your PIO who's contacting me and it's someone I've worked with before. So if you're trying to target a particular publication for a news story and you've never been in contact with that person, it's going to be probably a fairly low probability that you'll have success. But if you've already proven that you're a good, interesting source of ideas and stories, that just naturally makes us pay more attention when we see a name that we recognize appear in our inbox and say, oh, this person gave me a really good story once before. I wonder what they're up to now. And you might give them a little bit more attention. So what that means is cultivating your links with journalists where possible. Talk with them when you encounter them, even if you're not pitching them a story. just letting them know what you're working on and knowing you're available as a resource to ask, because we often go out looking for scientists, not because they've written the paper, but because they didn't write the paper, and we need comment. So we need to know that they're working in that field.
Absolutely, and on the other side, like you all know about other scientists who are doing interesting work. Journalists talk to each other about who's a good media savvy, so to speak, person, who is a good source. And if you have a reputation for not, working really well with media, like if you don't take media questions, if you don't cooperate, that sort of thing, then it makes it harder to get out of that rut, so to speak. So continuing to engage with journalists will help you to keep that up.
One thing I'm surprised none of you brought up is the fact that one big difference between science journalism and science is the timeline's all different. In that, for a science paper, that can be in the works for years. But a science story is going to be in the works for days, maybe weeks, if it's a really big one.
Maybe hours.
Yes.
Maybe hours. So to me, that would imply then it's important to sort of this relationship building. If a journalist contacts you, to get back in touch with them right away.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and sorry, go ahead, John.
No. You go ahead. You do take it.
Which is why, like you talked about, John, that, when we make these lab visits, go talk to scientists, go see them in their offices, so that we know what the space is to watch for, because we understand that, it is a longer time scale, that they might not have a study out right now that, we could include in our next story, but to know what they're thinking about, what the challenges maybe that they're facing, because challenges in itself, the process of science in itself is a good area to get good stories. Because we also make a note of that space, like watch for what's coming. Like they also know if there are going to be studies that are coming out in the next 2 or 3 months, so we can make a mental note of it, saying, to check back in at that point. So it's not, you don't have to have something out right now to get our attention. And many times we even want to go find those stories that have not yet been reported on, because if it's a really exciting and interesting study, you can bet that a lot of people are going to be covering it. So if we're looking for something to set ourselves apart, then we are wanting to look further down the line.
To play off that a little, it seems that much of the emphasis in these kinds of conversations is how do you get news out based on a new paper. And I think that there's nowhere near enough attention by scientists put toward cultivating relationships that could lead to feature stories and longer-term reporting projects and that kind of thing, because it depends on the publication, and the publications that I've been in haven't necessarily done breaking news. We've been looking for longer-term stories that aren't being covered elsewhere necessarily, and instead we're looking for trends and things that are coming up in importance, that sort of thing. And it doesn't necessarily have to have a new study, a new paper that's come out to hang the story on.
So I've lost my train of thought. Let's go to another thought I had, which was, we've talked a lot about how do you get your attention, but once we have it, or if you contact a scientist, we mentioned a big concern for scientists that they're not misquoted. There's always a concern. I'm going to be misquoted. What are some strategies scientists can use to make sure that there's some really critical things that it's really important to get right, that you get it across in a way that you're going to hear it the way they mean to say it?
I mean, I would say that a good place to start is, just to reiterate something we said a couple of different times before. If you know what your story is, I mean, start off, know what's the story that you're trying to tell the journalist about, and go into it in some ways, not just with the idea that you are telling them the science, but you are explaining a story to them, or at least giving them something that they can clearly make a story out of. You have to know what that story is, because they are there looking for a story. If you don't give them a story, they will have to try to come up with a story of their own. And that's one place where you as the scientist have started to then, you may not necessarily be happy with where it goes from there. Be very clear on what you want to say. If you've got the big nugget of science that you have to try to convey to people, figure out what's the most audience-friendly way you can convey that. Do you need to come up with some sort of analogy? Can you say it in something less than 200 words? It would be, you want to have something nice and pithy. Pay attention to like what are the quotes that show up in on television broadcasts or in print. Look at how long they are. They're not 200 words. They're 10 words, 30 words. That's that kind of soundbite. That's what people are looking to pay attention to. And be very careful about trying not to say the wrong things that someone's going to be able to seize onto. That's again where some of the kind of advice that public information officers ought to be able to give you about helping you to refine your message. But if you go to the journalist and here is something that is clearly a great story, most journalists would be happy to accept that story lovingly from your hands and do it in your words, rather than having to poke around and make a story out of what else you've given them.
So it seems to me, like the real key to all of the scientist perspective is something we've said a bunch of times, is the idea of having your story straight ahead of time, and not just like making sure you're not lying, but in the sense of what we traditionally think of as making your story straight, but in the sense of if you have a clear storyline, you're kind of helping the journalist along, and that's going to help the scientist along as well in all sorts of ways.
Definitely, and I think it makes a big difference if you practice telling the story at least once before you tell it to the journalist. Whether you're telling it to a colleague or your PIO or a family member or a friend or something like that, just going through that process more than once helps. The first time you do it, you will tend to stumble on your words, you'll get a bit lost, you might say something that's not quite accurate, and you don't want to be doing that in front of the journalist, because all they have to go on are what you've said, not what you're thinking.
Right.
Journalists don't misquote things very often, but people misspeak all the time. And we can't read your minds, unfortunately. We wish we could. That would make our jobs a heck of a lot easier. So practice first, and you'll find the whole interaction is much smoother.
Right, and speak simply also, because if you start naming off all of these like complicated names and terms, we're going to slow you down and have you explain things. You might lose your train of thought, but learn to sort of explain it. The classic example is, like, talk to me like I'm a 5-year-old, or, better yet, a high school level, because then I can actually understand the science. But aim it for that level, because that's kind of the level that a lot of us shoot for, because we can start there and always work our way up as far as complexity. But unless we really understand the basics of what you're talking about, chances are we're not really going to get it correct.
So we're sort of coming up to the close of time here. Are there any key points you'd like to bring up that we haven't touched upon yet, or anything you'd like to add to the conversation?
I mean, I think, especially after we maybe have said a few things that can sound kind of daunting about dealing with the media on this, I hope that would be reassuring to say that, again, although there are some exceptions to this, most of the time, when it comes to science journalism, the science reporter is not looking to make you look bad, scientists. In some ways, if you don't look good, your science doesn't look good, and it raises a question of why are we covering your story at all? You just, you I think can often find that if you help make it clear to the reporter that you share an interest with her or him in trying to get to a really good story, and that you want to be cooperative within what is appropriate to your respective positions, that the reporters will not be looking to try to make their reputation by slicing yours to ribbons.
Any final thoughts, Shraddha or David?
I just
No,
want
I
to echo what
definitely
John said,
agree.
really.
Oh, Yeah, same. I was just going to echo that as well. And like I said before, we really, really do try to get all the facts straight, because if we don't get it right, if we have to print corrections or something, it is a poor reflection on us. And that we really are trying to do a service both to scientists to represent their work fairly, but also to the public to make sure that they are able to take as much of an interest in the science as we are. You know, we're interested in this, and we want other people to also learn about this cool new study or cool new trend, or, you know, understand some of the larger issues that scientists are grappling with. And so we're just trying our best to balance the two. And so some of the questions that we ask, even if they seem really, really basic, a lot of it comes from that standpoint.
David.
I don't think I can add much more that hasn't been said by the others at this point. We are all in this together in some sense. We have slightly different goals, but there's a lot of commonality in what we're doing. So if we can find ways to work together effectively, it'll work out well for all of us.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank David, John, and Shraddha for being here for this conversation. So SciFund Voices, again, is a monthly panel series taking place on topics of interest in science outreach and science communication and science crowdfunding. It's the last Thursday of every month. If you'd like to find out more, you can sign up for our email list. If you go to scifundchallenge.org, there's a big button where you can sign up for our email list, and you'll be the first to know. You can also follow SciFund at SciFund, SCIFUND, on Twitter, and that's another way as well. Thanks again to the audience for listening, and thanks to the panelists. Panelists, you hang on.
Thanks.